most everybody knows me, but I thought I'd just say who I am because I'm one of the co-sponsors, we are one of the co-sponsors of this event. I'm director of the Prentice Institute for Global Population and Economy here at the University of Lethbridge, and also a bunch of cat and hat titles as well, professor of sociology, Canada Research Chair as well. And this event is co-sponsored with the Prentice Institute and the Institute for Studies in Child and the Institute for Studies of Youth and Children and Youth. What? Is that right? Fine. So it's about children, but it's also about a whole variety of things related to children that connect with population and life course. So it's great to sponsor, co-sponsor. We also have cookies. So this is an added bonus. So if you didn't get a cookie, you can run and grab one quickly. They're excellent cookies. Oh, really? Go ahead. Okay, so let me just say that the director of the Institute for the Studies of Children and Youth is Christine Alexander, who sits right there. There she is. So we thank them for collaborating with us in this effort, and she moderated the noontime session, so now it's my turn. What I'd like to do is introduce and tell you how delighted I am that Professor Willms has agreed to come here. He's a very, very well-known, internationally known scholar in education, children's development, human development. So it's really a delight to have him here. So what I'm going to do is share with you a tiny bit about him, and it's only a little bit of his very exciting career. Professor J. Douglas Willms is professor in the Faculty of Education at the University of New Brunswick and holds a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Literacy and Human Development. He's president of the International Academy of Education and a member of the U.S. National Academy of Education and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He's also president and CEO of a company called the Learning Bar Incorporated, an international company that provides research-based tools and training for enhancing the life chances of children and youth. Dr. Willms has published over 200 research articles and monographs pertaining to youth, literacy, children's health, and the accountability of school systems, and the assessment of national reforms in education. He's played lead roles in a number of things, and I'm just going to cite several. Developing Canada's National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth, which has been used extensively for analysis, and the OECD's Program for International Student Assessment, which is affectionately called Pisa, the Program for International Student Assessment. He and his colleagues designed the Early Years Evaluation, which is, I think that's an acronym, IYE, an instrument for the direct assessment of children's developmental skills at age 3 to 6, and another instrument, Our School, which is an evaluation system for the continuous monitoring of student engagement and well-being. Dr. Willms is the lead researcher in designing the contextual questionnaire for PISA, the international survey that I've mentioned, for development, an initiative for low and middle income countries aimed at tracking international education targets in the post-2015 UN framework. Very, very interesting and very innovative work. My comment, not his, but he knows it. It's state-of-the-art stuff and will contribute enormously to policy. His research team is also working with high school teachers in 30 First Nations schools in Canada in the design and implementation of Confident Learners, a whole school and whole community literacy program based on the science of literacy and instructional practice. So he's my valued colleague on the National Statistics Council, where we advise the chief statistician and his colleagues on collecting data, and a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. And I discovered last night at dinner something very interesting that I didn't know, that he actually taught at the University of Lethbridge for a year. After he got one of his master's degrees, he was here for a year teaching, and then he went off to California to get a PhD or another master's. Anyway, oh, okay. But he was here, which is quite amazing. Who knew? I had no idea. So that's quite interesting to know. So we're delighted and very honored to welcome Professor Willms, and I'm very pleased that he accepted our joint invitation to come here. And we will be to what he says. Thank you very much and welcome.
Well, it's indeed a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much for coming out. It's such a beautiful evening. I'm sure there are many other things you could have done this evening, but I'm absolutely pleased, and thank you, Susan and Christine, for sponsoring this event. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about equality, equity, and educational prosperity, actually in the opposite order. I'm going to talk about educational prosperity first of all, and then talk about mainly about some of the research programs that we've been working on for the last 10 years. And it's kind of easy because when you're listing them off there, all the big ones are all being used in Alberta, and so I've been able to pull some Alberta data to talk about them as I go. So we talked about our National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth, which was launched in 1994. And we began with a cohort of children aged 0 to 11 and started following them forward every 2 years. And when we had the first cycle of data, we had a network called the New Investigators Network, and we paired up young scholars from across the country with mentors in each of the universities, and we ended up developing this edited volume called Vulnerable Children. I wrote a few of the chapters, what in the British will call top and tail. I top and tailed it, did the front end and the rear end of it. Anyway, we had a model. HR, Human Resources Development Canada at the time said, but I want to know how many vulnerable children there are in Canada. And I said, well, that's a pretty hard question because it depends on where you set the cut points for mental health issues, for literacy, and so on. But I set some cut points and came out with the figure of 28%. I said 28% of Canadian children are vulnerable. Well, actually, this was before I was a member of the National Statistics Council. I got a phone call from the chief statistician, Ivan Falegi, at home, most unexpected, and he said, that's way too high. There's no way that nearly 1 in 3 children are vulnerable. Anyway, I stuck by my guns and kept with 28% because it matched up with some other work that Dan Offord was doing on mental health of children. It also matched up with the Pisa Study, and the dropout rate in Canada and so on. So I kind of like that figure, 28% or maybe 30% would be a reasonable figure to work with. So a question that I've been kind of obsessed with is, can we reduce childhood vulnerability down to 20%? Is that possible? So I'm going to start you off with probably, this is as complicated as it's going to get, folks, so just bear with me. These are data for Alberta on the Pisa Study, the Program of International Student Assessment. It's conducted every 3 years. We started in the year 2000, and in 2000 the emphasis was on reading literacy, and then 2003 it was math, and 2006 it was science, and so on. And the next cycle is coming out. It'll be the 2015 data, which will be released in December of this year. And it's a large study. We have 70 countries involved in the study now, and now we're adding 7 more in this study that Susan mentioned called PISA for Development. So these are data for Alberta. These are reading scores. The average score on the PISA survey is set to be 500, and the standard deviation is 100 for the OECD countries, not for all the countries, but just for the group of wealthy nations. For those of you who are not statistically inclined or are a little rusty, about 2/3 of everyone is plus or minus 1 standard deviation, so you got about 2/3 of everyone between 400 and 600 on that scale, and then you've got about 95% of everyone between 300 and 700, plus or minus 2 standard deviations. And then we have a measure of socioeconomic status, and it's standardized. In this case, I've standardized it to be 0 for Canada. Plus or minus 1 standard deviation is about 2/3 of everyone. Plus or minus 2 standard deviations is 2. And I've shaded in that area to the left of -1 because that would be typically what we think of as kids living in poverty. It's not a poverty measure, it's a socioeconomic measure. It includes mothers and fathers' level of education, mothers and fathers' occupation, and a measure of, we have a proxy for income. 15-year-olds don't have any clue what their parent's income is, so we ask a number of questions about educational possessions in the home. So each one of those dots then represents the scores of children, of one of the children in Alberta who did the Pisa study. This is in the year 2009, but it's been remarkably steady. So here you have a child with a score, a pretty high socioeconomic status score, but way down. He or she is even, I said he because they're mostly boys who score down at that level, I have to say. He or she is down below level 1. These tests are very well designed. We have big international committees just for the design of the reading test, another committee for the design of the math tests and so on, and my role in it was the design of the contextual questionnaires. So we'd look at measures of socioeconomic status and poverty and all the drivers of school effectiveness and so on. But in these reading tests, I always think of it as the 3 I's. You have to identify information, interpret it, and make inferences. So identify, interpret, and infer. And so kids down at levels 1 and 2, they can identify pieces of information from very familiar text, but they're a little hazy when it gets to making interpretations or inferring. When you get up into levels 5 and 6, those kids are able to identify 2 or 3 different pieces of information from unfamiliar text, and then make interpretations, and then make some inferences about what's going to happen next, or things like that, doing contrast and compare kind of things. So, and that's a pretty standard model across most achievement tests, including your Alberta tests that you've got. You know, you do your testing at grade 3, 6, 9, or 12, something like that. So we have about 30% of students in Alberta. We're back to that 28% figure. 30% of students in Alberta who are scoring at level 2 and lower. And that's just a real kind of basic functional level of literacy. We also look at, I just shouldn't say also, the line through the middle is what we call the socioeconomic gradient, or I affectionately refer to it as the learning bar. And I see the goal of social policy is to raise that bar up and to level it. And we've got a paper that I did for UNESCO called Learning Divides, and we talked about 5 types of interventions. And so the question is, should you focus on those kids to the left in the shaded area who are living in poverty and try to raise their scores? Or should you take the cut of skills of kids who have skills level 2 and lower and try to raise their scores up? Should you do compensatory interventions where you put more money into schools, or provide textbooks and free breakfasts and even washing machines in the school to make sure those schools have more resources? Or should you have universal interventions, which is for everyone, changing the curricula, reducing class size? And governments tend to go for universal interventions more often than targeted interventions. In most high-income countries, and especially if you can have good data early on, you want to have performance-based interventions. That is, you want to look at the kids across this way horizontally rather than vertically. On the other hand, interventions that target kids from poor families are also good. Economists have this expression, Alexander, help me out, it's called deadweight loss. They say, well, gee, if you intervene with those guys, there's a lot of those kids from poor families that are scoring at level 3 and 4. Aren't you wasting your money? And I say, no, not really, because you can still boost their scores up, and they serve as really good role models, and especially if you think of some kids from our First Nations communities. So anyway, if you really want to raise and level the learning bar, you've got to have performance-based interventions, because it raises it up, and it also levels it. Why? Because there's disproportionately more kids over there. You'll also see that if you look at the gradients, that's kind of the best fitting regression line. First of all, it's very straight, even though I fit in a quadratic equation that would allow it to bend. Saskatchewan's gradient bends, it goes up and then it levels off. But Alberta's is very straight. So, but you'll see it's not going in the right direction. It's been going down, and it's been of great concern to this government. These are what I call school profiles. All the gray dots are all the other schools in Canada. And so now on the y-axis, instead of the student level score, I've got the average school score. And it's set to have a mean of 500. Well, it's based on the student data, so I don't, usually the standard deviation at the school level is about 0.3 or something like that. But so you'll see there's quite a lot of variation among schools. And again, you get that gradient associated with school. So these are school mean achievements. So this is the average level of achievement for this school is somewhere around 360, and its average socioeconomic status is about a little below half a standard deviation below the average. Well, the first thing about this is we've got schools where the average level of socioeconomic status is below the poverty line. That just shouldn't happen in Canada, where you have that kind of concentration of poverty in certain schools. And you'll also see, if you look at the schools, say, that are serving average kids with average socioeconomic status, there's quite a wide range from this school down here to one way up there. That represents almost 2 grade levels of schooling. Now, I know none of you could imagine this, but imagine that you had an average child, average ability, average socioeconomic status, and you sent them over to this school instead of that school, and they came out 2 grade levels behind, where you wouldn't be too happy, right? So, but that's the kind of variation that we're dealing with. You can see Alberta schools there. The rural ones are in red, and the green ones, the green are urban public schools. Virtually no difference between those. We only got 1 private school in the sample in this case. Generally speaking, in Canada, if you don't adjust for socioeconomic background, private schools, the average scores are about a half grade level ahead. Once you control for socioeconomic status, 0. There's no private school advantage. All right. So if you're sending your child to a private school, you're wasting your money, I'd say. You're better off to find a good public school. Okay, moving right along. So when we look internationally and we say, what is the percentage of kids who get on Pisa at level 3 and higher? This is below. I'm going the other direction. I have another one, I go this way. If we ask that question, what percentage of kids have reading literacy scores below level 2? When you get down to these very poor countries with GDP below 10,000, you're getting 70 or 80% of the kids who are with very low literacy scores. And it comes down and it kind of levels off at around 35, 40%. There's the US, it's at around 42% of kids with scores at level 2 and lower. And there's Canada sitting right in there. There's a line on the wall there that's quite handy because it's at 30%, almost 29%. So Canada's sitting in there back at 28% of kids not learning to read well. Okay? So can we get that down to 20% would be the question. So this is the overall driving question, I'd say, that's driven my whole research career, is how can we improve children's cognitive, behavioral, and health outcomes while reducing inequalities associated with family background? Or the shorthand for that is raising and leveling the learning bar. So Canadian research really stresses the importance of creating a framework of understanding amongst parents and community leaders of the importance of inclusive environments. I was at a dinner meeting with the late Dr. Fraser Mustard, who had a tremendous influence on child development in Canada. And I said something about convincing governments we do, and he says, just about jumped across the table. That's not how you bring about change. You have to create a framework of understanding. And he said amongst the elite, but I think more generally you have to create a framework of understanding amongst parents and community leaders of the importance of inclusive environments. Using leading indicators to inform school policy and practice. I'm going to be showing you some of the tools that we've been using in Alberta, namely the Our School Survey, the early years evaluation, and we've really worked hard at trying to reposition assessment to think about, instead of using it for accountability, to say here's how well you've done and your school's doing well or not well, to saying, here's how well your kids are doing, what are you going to do going forward to bring these kids' scores up? Enabling students to traverse the reading mountain, which I'll talk about soon, and maintaining a relentless focus on the foundations for success. So, educational prosperity. This is just a warm-up, folks, for what I'm going to talk about. I'm just getting started now at 7:25. So, it's a life course approach. This little boy is in one of our First Nations communities that we've been working with, and he's on his way home from the first day at school, and from kindergarten. And if this boy was born 20 years ago, and reaching graduation age now, or say 15 years ago, you'd only have a 28% chance of graduating, which was the graduation rate in Saskatchewan. We're up to about 30% now, but it's really terrible in all three prairie provinces. So the question is, can we improve his chances of success as well? So educational prosperity includes a set of outcomes that we call prosperity outcomes, and it starts at conception. It's not at school age, it's right from conception. So we want to look at outcomes when children are born, at age 2, at age 5, and so on. So I've broken it into six stages of development. There's nothing Piagetian about it. It's just kind of life according to Doug Willms, but I've tried to marry it up to the way a lot of school systems operate and what a lot of the research says. So we have the prosperity outcomes, and we also have a set of family, institutional, and community factors, which I call the foundations for success. The foundations for success are things like quality instruction at the school level. They're things that are hard to argue with, that should traverse, they should be relevant foundations for all countries. Now you can quibble about some of the prosperity outcomes if you like. Maybe in one country they say, no, but we really want to focus more on kids acquiring a second language, for example, and that's not in there. But generally speaking, you'll see that there are outcomes that are important across all countries. And so the model looks at 4 ways that success accumulates across the lifespan. This is a slide that I used a lot before I actually wrote out this model called educational prosperity. And it's basically saying you've got important outcomes at birth over there on the left. So we know some of the drivers during the prenatal phase, and they're in red because those are risk factors rather than protective factors. Alcohol use, smoking, drug use during pregnancy, and then when children are born, their birth weight, premature births, delivery complications, and so on. And that then leads to early years outcomes. And those early years outcomes, awareness of self and environment, cognitive skills, language communication skills, and so on, that's a framework that UNESCO uses. There's a very nice paper called Getting Ready. It's done by a 17-state consortium in the US. So there's not too much debate nowadays about what we should measure as kids are entering school. We know these are key skills that kids need to be able to be successful at school. The 2 green arrows connecting the red boxes, that's where we spend a lot of our energy in the National Longitudinal Survey of Children and Youth. And we looked at a lot of different factors, and some of the important factors were maternal depression. Probably paternal depression is important too, but the literature shows quite clearly that maternal depression is the more important thing. And I'm not talking just about postpartum depression, but more prolonged depression. Family engagement. We looked at about 26 different factors of how parents engaged with their children, taking them to the park, playing board games, watching TV with them, and so on. And there's one, when you put them in one of my fancy regression models, there's one factor that pushes everything else out of the model, and that's reading to the child every day. Hugely important factor. Family functioning, which has to do with how well the family functions as a cohesive unit. Not just how well the mother and father get along, but how well it functions as a unit. And then finally, parenting styles. And we when we were designing the National Longitudinal Survey, we did put a lot of effort into looking at various models of parenting styles. There's a very famous model developed by a woman named Bomrand, and she talks about authoritarian parenting styles, where the parent's kind of a my way is the highway, versus permissive parenting styles, and where parents are very loving and generous with their kids, but there's no structure to it all. And you want both of those things operating together, which is in the literature is called an authoritative parenting style. And that work's been popularized by a woman named Barbara Colaroso. She talks about those authoritarian parents as brick wall parents, and the permissive ones as jellyfish parents, and the ones who do both as backbone parents. So we applied this model at the early childhood phase, and it actually works really well at early childhood as well. Kids who are with backbone parents, those authoritative parents, and I use the terms love and guidance. The love part is, being responsive to kids' needs and so on. I couldn't quite get the term love into an academic research article, but I did get the term guidance in, because I think the authoritarian part is, there's rules of engagement. There's ways to behave in church, and there's ways to behave in school, and different social settings, and there's rules of the game that you've got to socialize kids into. When you've got that right combination of love and guidance, that's when you get really powerful outcomes. And in fact, the effects of positive parenting is just as big as the effects associated with poverty. So hugely important. Thanks. Moving right along, I'm going to be talking about learning to read. And here's where, in my view, is the real critical juncture for a lot of kids. It's the transition from learning to read to reading to learn. So around about age 8 or 9, they have to make that transition. And then you're into the 3 big pieces that affect school completion, which are having good academic achievement. Of course, if you don't learn to read well, and we've shown with our National Longitudinal Survey and several surveys in the US, kids who do not learn to read well, 93% of them are struggling readers all the way through school. Why? Because after grade 3, the emphasis changes from teaching kids how to read. Now they got to read stuff. They got to read science. They got to read health. They've got to read all the different subject areas. And imagine, of course, that's going to affect their achievement. So we kind of work them through middle school, and they muddle along. By the time they hit high school, they're in special programs, and they don't thrive at all and become very disaffected with school. So that's a really key thing. And imagine the psychological toll of going to school every day and seeing your peers moving ahead further and further, and you're just stuck not understanding most of what's going on. So you have real high levels of anxiety and depression amongst that group, and then eventually a lot of those kids then engage in risky behaviors, alcohol use and so on, drug use. And then the third big component is student engagement, and that's really what our school surveys focuses on in Alberta. So I developed this model then called prosperity outcomes. Those are the outcomes along the top. So at birth, you want to have a healthy pregnancy and a healthy delivery. And then you've got language development, cognitive development, and so on, all the way through to age 16. And that's where some of the outcomes you might disagree with, ones I've chosen. Those might vary, but the early ones I think are pretty consistent across. And then you've got those drivers of those things, which we call the foundations for success at each of the 6 stages of development. I'm going to be sending Susan a copy of the slide deck, so you don't need to, no one's taking notes anyway, so it doesn't matter. But if you're inclined to take notes, don't worry. So the model says that success accumulates in 4 ways: through biological embedding, through the foundations for success, through cumulative development, and through selection. So here's what it looks like. And I won't belabor this because I'm going to show you each of the pieces separately, but basically the little orange arrows are biological embedding, which really mostly happens during during pregnancy and during those first 2 years of birth. Then you've got the foundations at all stages of development are affecting kids' scores. And then you've got the cumulative development. So if we're looking at PISA scores at age 15, and we go to great lengths to measure 20 or 30 different factors that might affect achievement, kids, the learning climate in the school and the family background, what the family's doing. The best predictor would be if we had a score of their achievement at age 9. That would be a much better predictor of what's happening rather than all these other variables. So at each stage of development, one set of outcomes begets success at the next stage. And then the final one is selection, which are the red arrows. So even as early as age 2, kids get selected into certain kinds of preschools programs, and there's programs for the rich and the programs for the not so rich. And then when they enter the school system, again, there's many mechanisms. Our societies are very clever at developing special programs that segregate kids as they make their way through. So here we are at birth. We want good nutrition, no exposure to toxins, good physical health and emotional health, good birthing experiences, and so on. So this notion of biological embedding, which was part of a program through the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research that I was involved with. So a lot of neuroscientists, including your own Brian Kolb here. We say differential social experiences get under the skin in early life, and through their effects on developing neurobiological pathways, affect later trajectories in human health, learning, and behavior. So the notion of biological embedding is that things happen during pregnancy and during the first couple of years of life that are quite permanent. They really can lend the child vulnerable for the long term. I use the example, some of them have latent effects as well, so they look okay at the beginning and then something, you're more vulnerable later on. And I use the example of obesity. There's 3 times in our life when we develop more fat cells. If any of us eat too much now, have too many of these cookies, the fat cells just get bigger. We don't get more fat cells. But during the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, the fetus will get more fat cells during that first year of life, actually about first 6 months of life, they get more fat cells. And then there's a period during adolescence. My son is age 16 right now, and that's just the age when they can develop more fat cells. And that's a bad thing because he might look fit now, but later on, if he's got too many fat cells, he'll be more prone to becoming obese. So that's one example. But there's chemical signatures get attached to the genes that will lend the child to be more prone to disease, have poor cognitive development, and so on later on. So we say that they get under the skin. We've spent a lot of time looking at why are there socioeconomic gradients. So there's gradients also in things like breastfeeding. If poor families are less likely in our country to breastfeed their babies than more well-to-do parents, mothers. Smoking during pregnancy, same thing, there's a gradient. Getting under the skin is that there's a rapid development of the brain during that period. So there's billions of neurons, and during that course of development, these neurons form connections called synapses. And if those aren't formed, then that part of the brain gets pruned away. They talk about the sculpting of the brain. Max Ziniter at the University of British Columbia talks about kids who have had eye injuries, and they might have an eye injury and have a patch during a critical period of development, and after that patch is taken off, that eye will never regain sight. Why? Because that part of the brain actually didn't get developed and got pruned away. And there are a lot of different examples of that. So there's a lot going on during those first few years of life. And then you've got up to age 2. This is one of my favorite slides. It's from work by Susan Huntenlocker at the University of Chicago. And she tracks children's vocabulary skills. She has mothers coming into a controlled setting with their babies at age 12 months. And every 2 months, she tracks their skills and looks at the size of their vocabulary. And there's a very nice, so here's these are boys in green on very slow trajectories, and some girls up there at the very end, one boy up there on a very fast trajectory. The thing is about that age, if you know the children's book, Franklin the Turtle, we don't know if these kids are, if those guys at the bottom there are Franklin the Turtles that are going to be plodding along, and they could have, some type of intellectual intellectual impairment or whatever, intellectual disability. Or they might be, the other children's book that I like is called Leo the Late Bloomer, and they might be late bloomers, and maybe they'll eventually take off. But that's a huge gap if you look at kids at 24 months, and these guys have got kind of 100 words, and some of those other ones around 400 words. There's a very nice book called Meaningful Differences by Hart and Risley, which is a must-read for people in your center, and they've got some similar graphs, and they say that a child needs to hear a word about 7 times before that synapse connects. And in fact, Huttenlocher shows that the extent of mother's speech, the more talkative mothers are the kids who are on much faster trajectories. So this is just a graph about those critical periods, which was part of this Council for Early Child Development. And you can see that a lot happens there during those first few years of life. I've forgotten her name. I told you I have these senior moments. I'm actually, I said earlier that I'm younger than both Clinton and Trump, and I'm healthier as well. I'm not sure about my memory, though. We won't comment on that. Anyway, there's a woman also at UBC who introduces kids to non-Hindi speakers, introduce them to Hindi sounds at 3 months of age before they've ever said their first words. And then at 9 months of age, the kids can still recognize those sounds. They have one of those tests, those hearing tests where they show kids the light. We should have something like that. Janet Worker, there we go. She's done that research. And there's also research at Queen's that have shown that kids 1 day after they're born can distinguish between the sound of the mother's voice versus another female's voice. So lots going on during those early years. Cumulative development. So children develop skills in a cumulative way as they make the transition from one stage to the next. So I'm going to say a little bit about our early years evaluation. I was asked by the World Bank to develop a tool that could be used in India, Jordan, and Dominican Republic to measure kids' skills at age 4 and 5. And so we developed this assessment tool called the Early Years Development, and later the Canadian government gave us some money to develop it for the Canadian population. We're now in, more than 1,000 schools across the country. But in Alberta, we're in at least 45 out of the 62 districts. I think we're up to 50 now, probably over 50. In fact, 2 of my colleagues were here in Lethbridge today working with some of your teachers, training them on the use of this tool. So it measures the skills in those 5 developmental areas. These are the areas that are recognized by UNESCO as the important areas of development. It's most often used in a transition to school program. And we have 2 different tools. One is a direct assessment where an evaluator sits down with the child, takes about 45 minutes. And it's really fun. If any of you in that area and you know the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, it's like that. We have an easel format and the kids are asked questions, but ours is much more interactive. There's some fun things. They're up and they're hopping and they're catching a soccer ball and things like that. So they really love doing. I've got some colleagues that are really against this kind of thing. They say, they talk about the schoolification of kindergarten, but more important, they say, it just stresses kids out. Why are they going to have test anxiety before they hit grade 1? But anyone who has actually worked with children know that if kids are anxious, they'll be clinging to the mother's or father's pant leg and won't sit down to do the assessment anyway. But in fact, kids love doing the assessment. They love to show you what they can do, and the part of the training is giving the assessors skills to develop rapport with kids. We don't have to give much training because almost all of our assessors are retired kindergarten, retired grade 1 teachers. And then we have a teacher-based assessment where teachers observe kids in the classroom over a period of 6 weeks. And we structure those observations, and then they go online and they fill out the things. So after they do it, one of the other assessments that's used in Alberta, the teachers fill it out, and it takes about 8 months to a year before the data are all analyzed and the reports are given. Our reports are given in less than 1 second. So as soon as they fill it out, boom, you get the report immediately. And it's an individual child report, and they get a PDF file that they can share with parents and so on. And we code them red, yellow, green, whether kids have appropriate development or experiencing some difficulty or experiencing significant difficulty. Oh, I thought I'm rather proud because we just got this report in Inuktitut because we're doing work in Inuvit, and it's wild. It looks like hieroglyphics to me. But so we're in English, Spanish, French, and Inuktitut. So, as I said earlier, we try to use this tool to say what the things look like going forward. And so we've got a model called responsive tiered instruction. And so we're using this tool as a prediction model. We have a prediction model for saying which kids are going to need extra support as they make their way along. Oh, I lied. I told you the most difficult one was that second slide. This is the prediction model. Those of you who are statistically inclined, it's the logistic regression model. So it's actually more simple than it looks. It says probability of Y, which is the outcome equaling 1 being a successful outcome, and that vertical line means given X, which is the scores on the EYE, on the early years evaluation, is equal to that formula, 1 over 1 plus EXP to the minus beta X. My colleague who does the training, she calls it Doug's recipe. She says you need 1 cup of cognitive skills, 3/4 of a cup of language and communication skills, and so on. But note that it's cognitive skills and language skills that are the biggest drivers of whether kids learn to read well. So the outcome here is successful reading. So we've tracked kids from kindergarten through to grade 3 to see whether they become successful readers. And we draw cut points. If you're over 80% probability, we say you're green, you're good to go. We don't like any false positives in this business. If you're between 50 and 80, then you're yellow, you're tier 2. You have tier 2 learning needs, and red would be below 50, you have tier 1 learning needs. So we plot that out, and we give feedback to school districts. Here's the map of Calgary. I've been given permission to show this. And you can see, huge differences in vulnerability across schools. There's some schools where over 60, 70% of the kids have tier 2 or tier 3 learning needs. Whereas the school down here has only about 10% learning needs. I'm ashamed to say we're using the 2006 census data for the background to show these are the dissemination areas from the 2006 census, but we're soon going to have some data from 2016. So I'll come back to that slide later. Foundations for success. So the foundations for success are those green things that push things up as we go along. I'm going to skip over that slide because I'm running out of time. These are, when you hit the school age, we really need explicit teaching in code-related skills and language skills, good quality instruction, and so on. So this brings me to confident learners. And I have to say, these other tools, I've been working on them for 10 years, and we've got a great staff that manages that whole operation. But this is a program that I'm most deeply engaged in my research and my passion at the moment. We've been working with 32 First Nations on reserve schools over the last 4 or 5 years, developing this program, and we're now ready to launch. We had some schools that delved into it more deeply. We call them the Wave 1 schools. last year. One from Alberta, way up north in it's called Tall Cree. It's up in high level. And now we hope to have another one coming on this year in Alberta. First Nations, we have an advisory circle, and we've got districts, including Calgary, Ministry of Education in Saskatchewan, are chafing at the bit to have this program because it's such a huge need right now. But our advisory circle, our First Nations advisory circle, they kind of ganged up on me and said, no, we don't want you to go to the public sector yet. And I said, why not? And they said, one woman said, because we want them to beg for it. She says, we've had the white person's program shoved down our throats for the last 100 years, and now we've got something that we've developed, and they're so proud of it. You know, we have a training program with a teacher development program, teacher training program that has these 16 modules, and we have videos of First Nations teachers demonstrating high-yield teaching strategies, for example. We have another one on learning time and strategies to increase school attendance and increase effective learning time within this classroom and so on. And it's all First Nations moderators and so on. So we're pretty excited about that, and they're really excited about it. We started doing our videos in New Brunswick, and then they said, no, you need to come out to our school. So I had to send our videographer across the country, and which he loved. Did a beautiful job of these videos. So its initiative brings to bear the science of reading, science of learning how to read, a rigorous curriculum aligned with teaching activities and assessments, quality professional development, and the support of communities and families to ensure First Nations children become fluent readers. There's a little map of where we are. These were our partner schools that worked with us on the development of the program. We looked at a lot of different models of reading. There's I don't know how many, but there's 4 or 5 prominent ones. One's called the Searchlight model in the UK, for example. It has 4 components. We landed on this one because it's very popular amongst reading specialists, called the Simple View of Reading. And it really just says that to learn how to read, you need to be able to decode words, that is, sound them out, and also to be able to recognize particular words. In the English language, we have about 20% of our words, you can't sound them out, like the word sight. Essay, it's good. You can't sound it out, you have to actually see it and recognize it. But that's really key, is for kids to learn how to decode words. And that's the act of reading itself. The reading specialists say that is reading. All of us could probably read Greek. We can sound it out and read it, but we won't know what it means. And that's the second component, understanding the words that are involved. This is a graph. If you Google on Simple View of Reading, any of you were the earlier talk today, if you happen to Google on it, you would get lots and lots of images that look like this. They don't call it a deficit approach, but if you took a cross-section of kids and looked at their language skills and their code-related skills, you have some kids that are good in both. That's where you want to be. You have some kids, and usually these kids have very specific learning disabilities. I know a child who's near and dear to my heart who had phenomenal language skills. This would be right out here. But when she started grade 3, she had very poor coding skills. In fact, when we had her tested, she was at a pre-K level in her skills, so she couldn't read at all going into grade 3. And parents were very frustrated trying to get her. So we had her to a tutoring agency, 100 hours of tutoring, specifically on code-related skills, and she went from 0 up to a grade 3 level by Christmas. And so the manager of the center said, well, Dr. Willms, she's made remarkable progress, but we think she could be above grade level by the end of grade 3. Would you like us to continue? I said, Mary, here's my Visa card, another 100 hours, and we could afford it, but that's not right in a way that some parents can afford it, some people can't. But that's the kind of intensive intervention that you need. What was it, 200 hours of intervention? Remember that RTI model? The kids with Tier 2 learning needs, they typically need 3 extra hours a week of direct instruction usually on coding skills. And usually in groups of 3 or 4. Kids with Tier 3 learning needs, the ones in red, they need an extra hour a day, and it's usually one-on-one. And a lot of those kids you won't get up to green. You'll get them up to yellow. Some of them we get up to green, but they need a more intensive intervention. So, specific learning disabilities, there's one type of learning disability in that upper left quadrant, but a lot of the immigrants, students that are immigrant children coming in, they may have good coding skills, but they haven't acquired the language. They'll quickly move over to the right. But a lot of our population, remember I said 30% vulnerable, they're over in this quadrant, and they've got a mixture of things on the autism spectrum, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, just delayed development due to poverty and so on. So you have to watch my sleight of hand here. You can focus, say, on these two dots here, and I'm not doing anything except moving the axes. The dots are staying exactly where they are. So what we did is we amassed all the curricula from the 10 provinces, one of the territories. There was a good program from Australia and Texas, of all places, one from the UK, and that's my political bias coming out when I say Texas, of all places. Sorry about that. Lost my train of thought. Anyway, so we allocated all of these, we identified all of the objectives and developed a sequence of coding skills and language skills from kindergarten up to the end of grade 3. And we put them into 20 different steps. And so 20 steps of coding, 20 steps of language. And my idea was a very simple one. It's just like the Red Cross swimming badges. Those of you who are proud recipients of them will know that they used to start with starfish, and then they go up to minnows, and then the whale, frogs and a whale, and so on. And then you got 12 levels. And it's so transparent. Kids know where they are, and they know what they need to do to go to the next step. Well, I got to be able to swim 4 lengths of the pool and tread water for 20 minutes and so on. So I wanted it to be like that. So the kids know where they are, the parents know where they are, teachers know where they are, and so on. So we developed a model for that. And I sat with the literacy people, these 3 literacy experts, while we're developing code-related, the sequence. And they said, well, that skill they should know that by the middle of grade 1. They should know that skill by the end of grade 1. They should know this skill by the beginning of grade 1. And so they had a grade-based model, because they said 20 steps, that's 5 steps per grade level. Makes sense. When he plotted it out like this, there's this huge mountain of skills that kids have to get over to succeed in grade 1. And if they don't succeed, then they have very, very much difficult going on. And to go back to that red, yellow, green, the kids who are yellow are usually anywhere from half a year to a full year behind their peers, their age peers. And if they're red, they're more than a year. And you add on to that your birth date. I've got all 3 of our kids were fall babies. And so they got to get over that reading mountain, very difficult. So we leveled the reading mountain. We've got 20 steps of coding, 20 steps of language, and each one of those steps now has 14 objectives. And you may ask me, what's First Nations about this? It actually will work with any child, but we've linked every one of those objectives, some 560 of them, to learning activities. And the learning activities honor the Indigenous ways of knowing. So there are things about outside, working with the earth. I use the example of crossing the stream, where the teacher puts a stream on the floor and puts stepping stones, and the kids have to say the letters on the stepping stone to cross the stream. And they love it. They love that stuff. Building success with quality instruction. We've been measuring quality instruction with the Our School surveys. This is Alberta data from a report from a few years ago. And we have a cut point again, say at what level, or what percentage of kids feel they're getting quality instruction. And it just falls quite sharply. You can see after grade 7. If you look at valuing schooling outcomes for boys and girls, it also falls. Effective learning time during the secondary school years falls. And you can see that all the way through on most of our outcomes in terms of student engagement, that student engagement and also the drivers of schooling outcomes. Well, basically the story is our secondary schools aren't working for most of our kids, for at least half of our kids. There's a very nice book called Visible Learning, which is a meta-analysis of meta-analyses, if you know what that is. It's a synthesis of all the syntheses that have been done in the thing. He's very keen on this outward bound model, and he says you basically got to present visible, tangible learning goals, and then the training involves teaching kids in incremental steps and creating feedback. And Hattie talks about feedback not as teacher feedback to the students, but creating an atmosphere of feedback where kids give feedback to each other. We passed the climbing wall on the way in. That's a good outward bound example, and the key is that kids themselves can give each other feedback. And then finally, helping kids overcome barriers to success. He's got a whole bunch of things on effective teaching, and I wanted to stop on this one. What we've been training our First Nations teachers to do is structured teaching. And if you go in a lot of schools, and not just First Nations schools, schools where you have a lot of vulnerable kids, the teachers are doing one of three things. They're either having kids work in workbooks at their desk, or they're talking to kids, or the teacher's working at their desk doing administrative stuff. And so actually getting them up and organizing a lesson, setting clear goals, activating, here's what we're going to learn today, activate the prior learning, actually model the skill, and then guide it. And that big one, number 4, that's where you have activities like crossing the stream and so on. And then you can have what's called closure, where you check for understanding, and then providing independent practice. When we started working with confident learners, we wanted a family piece, and so we did a lot of kind of community mapping to see what resources were available, but we weren't really getting anywhere. And so in year 2, we fixed on these 3 things. One of them was trying to get every child read to every day. And some parents can't read to their child, so you got to work something out where kids are being read to at noon hour or whatever. So they're read to at least 15 minutes every day. And we know that's a really powerful effect. School attendance, getting kids to school every day, and then finally getting parents engaged in literacy activities at home. And again, we've got videos with First Nations families doing these activities, so it doesn't seem like it's coming from outside. I'm going to finish up on this 5 types of students. In our school survey, we measure a lot of the assets related to school completion, and I'll just show you really quickly. Actually, won't have time, but basically you've got about, again, you're back to this 17, 20, there's 26% of kids. Those are all the kids who didn't learn to read well, and those kids have very poor mental health outcomes. And quite often we're so focused on their behavior, but their levels of anxiety and depression are more than 3 times the kids who are in that first group there, the engaged students, who are the kids we tend to love. There's also this group called the quiets, who they're kind of on the cusp between B and A grades, but they aren't making positive friendships at school, they're not participating in sports and clubs, and they lack social engagement, and they too have poor mental health outcomes. And then selection, I won't say too much, just the equality and equity, because that was in the title. Remember I said that was going to come at the end? We're really developing models to say, if you're looking at academic achievement, how does that vary? How do levels of achievement vary for males and females, for different socioeconomic groups, for different ethnic groups, and so on? And the prosperity part, these are the drivers. The key is really to focus on just that small set of drivers. Our models have 20 or 30 factors, but these are the ones that are closest to the outcome. We say they're proximal. They're also pervasive. They affect a range of outcomes. And they're not mediated by other factors. Okay. And you could see the slides later, but we look at how likely kids are at risk. That's the equality part, and then the equity part as well. One of the ones that I find interesting is If you look at First Nations kids, they're almost twice as likely to have low expectations for success. And I find it interesting because we're getting the same results for the Maori kids in Australia. So here we're back to our wee boy walking home from school, and I've been described as a pathological optimist. He wasn't born 20 years ago. He was born maybe 7 or 8 years ago now. And so I think he'll have a better chance of graduating than kids in the previous decade. And it happens through strong leadership, through dedicated teachers, family and community support, and finally a relentless focus on building the foundations for success. Thank you very much.